Egypt was a graveyard of gods, but for the fleeing Hebrews, the desert was about to become a trap. Hemmed in by mountains and hunted by an empire, they were forced to choose between a watery grave and an Egyptian sword. The narration, the Exodus, was not merely a departure. It was a rhythmic, massive migration of 2 million souls that stretched from horizon to horizon. At the head of this impossible column stood Moses, no longer the stuttering fugitive of Midian, but a titan of faith whose shepherd's staff had become a scepter of divine authority. Behind him followed a sea of humanity, men carrying the ancient, weathered bones of the patriarch Joseph, women shielding infants from the stinging desert grit, and children leading the bleeding livestock that had survived, the hail and the locusts. Above them, the sky held a terrifying wonder, the Shekinah glory. By day, it was a pillar of cloud, a massive, swirling vortex that provided a canopy of shade from the blistering Sinai sun. By night, it ignited into a pillar of fire, a roaring column of celestial flame that turned the desert night into a midday glow, casting long, dancing shadows across the dunes and ensuring the march never faltered. They moved with the frantic hope of a people reborn, yet the air remained thick with the scent of unleavened bread and a lingering, heavy tension that suggested their trials were far from over. Back in the ruins of Memphis, the silence of the palace was broken, only by the sound of grinding teeth and the dripping of water in empty fountain courts. Pharaoh sat upon his throne, his golden crown askew, staring into the middle distance. He looked at his empty fields, his broken temples, and the hollow eyes of his grieving subjects. The grief in his heart, which should have led to repentance, instead curdled into a cold, diamond-hard madness. "What have we done?" he hissed, his voice echoing through the vaulted stone halls. He didn't just want his slaves back. He wanted to erase the memory of their God and the humiliation of the 10 plagues from the face of the earth. He gave the word, and the machinery of war groaned to life with a terrifying efficiency. He summoned his elite guard, 600 chosen chariots, the Ferraris of the ancient world. These were not mere wagons. They were bronze-clad killing machines, pulled by stallions bred for the chaos of slaughter, and draped in the colors of the empire. Thousands of infantry followed, their shields clattering against their armor like the scales of a great serpent. As Pharaoh climbed into his own golden chariot, a roar went up from the army that shook the very foundation of the palace. They weren't just marching to war. They were marching to a massacre, fueled by a decade of suppressed rage and the desire for vengeance. Days later, the Israelites reached the place called Pi-Hahiroth. It was a strategic nightmare. To their left and right, the mountains of Baal-Zephon rose like jagged, iron-colored teeth, impassable and steep. In front of them, the Red Sea stretched out, deep, blue, and indifferent to their plight. Moses gave the command to camp, but the rest felt more like a funeral vigil. The first sign of the coming storm was not a sound, but a feeling, a low, rhythmic thrumming in the soles of their feet that caused the water in their leather skins to ripple. Then the horizon turned a sickly gray. A wall of dust, miles wide and hundreds of feet high, began to rise against the setting sun. Then came the glint, the terrifying, rhythmic sparkle of thousands of bronze spearheads and the golden breastplates of the Egyptian officers. The invincible army had arrived, and they had found their prey pinned against the shore. Panic ripped through the Hebrew camp like a wildfire in dry grass. The people who had just seen the Nile turned to blood, and the sun disappeared for 3 days now, looked at the approaching dust and lost their minds to terror. They surrounded Moses, their voices thick with the hysteria of the doomed, clutching at his robes and weeping in the sand. "Were there no graves in Egypt that you brought us here to die in the wilderness?" they screamed. "Did we not tell you in Egypt to leave us alone so we could serve our masters? It would have been better to live in chains than to fall here by the sword." Moses stood amidst the screaming crowd, a lone pillar of granite in a sea of shifting sand. He did not look at the chariots, nor did he look at the terror-stricken faces of his kinsmen. He looked up at the sky where the pillar of cloud began to stir. He raised his hand, his voice cutting through the howling wind with the weight of a mountain. "Fear ye not. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord which he will show you today. For the Egyptians whom ye have seen today, ye shall see them again no more forever. The Lord shall fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace." In that moment, the pillar of cloud did something unexpected and magnificent. It rose from the front of the line, swept over the heads of the people, and settled like a heavy curtain of impenetrable obsidian, between the Israelites and the Egyptians. On one side, Pharaoh's army was plunged into a supernatural, freezing fog so thick the drivers could not see their own horses' ears, stalling the charge in a mess of tangled harnesses and confusion. On the other side, the pillar blazed with a brilliant, comforting light, illuminating the shoreline for the Hebrews as if it were high noon. Moses stepped toward the water's edge, where the waves lapped gently at his sandals. Under the command of a silent, divine whisper, he stretched out his hand and the heavy staff over the deep. Suddenly, a violent east wind, the Ruach, the very breath of the Creator, began to howl across the water. It wasn't a normal gale. It was a physical force that tore into the surface of the sea, ripping the tides apart with the strength of 1,000 hurricanes. Throughout the night, the Israelites watched in stunned, breathless silence as the water was piled up on either side by an invisible, almighty hand. The sound was like the grinding of tectonic plates, a roar that drowned out the cries of the camp. When the first light of dawn finally touched the horizon, the impossible stood before them. The sea had been cut in half. 2 massive walls of water, hundreds of feet high and glowing with an inner bioluminescence, stood congealed like solid glass. Between them lay a wide sandy highway, dry as a bone and smelling of the deep mysteries of the ocean. "Go forward," Moses commanded, and with the thundering of the Egyptian army beginning to break through the fog behind them, a nation of slaves stepped into the belly of the abyss, walking where no man had ever walked before. The miracle was not the end. It was the beginning of a nightmare for the gods of Egypt. As the walls of water held back the weight of the world, the Hebrews realized that the only thing more terrifying than being chased by an army was being protected by the Creator. The march through the seabed was a journey through a corridor of shadows. On either side, the Israelites looked up at walls of water that towered like liquid skyscrapers, so translucent they could see the dark shapes of leviathans swimming within the depths, held back by an invisible divine tether. The ground beneath their feet, which should have been a mucky graveyard of silt and shipwrecks, was miraculously dry and firm, as if the very atoms of the earth had been reorganized for their passage. Moses stood at the rear, his staff still extended, watching as the millions of his people scrambled toward the far shore of Midian. The air inside the chasm was cold and carried the heavy, salt-drenched scent of the ancient deep, a silence so profound it was broken only by the frantic breathing of a nation running for its life. Behind them, the supernatural fog of the pillar began to lift. Pharaoh, standing in his golden chariot, saw the impossible path through the sea and didn't hesitate. To him, this wasn't a miracle. It was a tactical opportunity. "After them," he screamed, his voice cracked with a decade of frustration. With a thunderous crack of whips, the 600 elite chariots plunged into the abyss. The sound of thousands of hooves hitting, the sandy floor echoed off the walls of water like a drumbeat of doom. The Egyptian army moved with a terrifying speed, their bronze wheels spinning through the shadows, gaining ground on the elderly and the children who lagged at the back of the Hebrew line. They were in the heart of the sea, the midpoint of the miracle, when the atmosphere suddenly changed. A divine gaze looked down from the pillar of fire and threw the Egyptian host into a state of absolute chaos. Suddenly, the dry ground turned into a treacherous mire. The heavy, gold-plated wheels of the chariots began to bind and snap off their axles. Horses screamed as they sank to their knees in sand that had turned to quicksand in an instant. The invincible army was no longer a charging force. It was a tangled heap of broken wood and panicked men. The Egyptian officers looked up at the towering walls of water and saw them begin to tremble. "Let us flee from the face of Israel," they cried, "for their God fights for them against us." But it was too late. The last of the Israelites stepped onto the eastern bank, and Moses, standing on the high ground, turned back toward the sea. He stretched out his hand one final time. The Ruach, the great wind that had held the waters, suddenly ceased. The silence lasted only a heartbeat before the roar began, a sound like the collapse of 1,000 mountains. The massive walls of water, no longer restrained, came crashing down from both sides with a force that pulverized the chariots and silenced the screams of the soldiers in an instant. The Red Sea reclaimed its territory, and the pride of Egypt was swallowed by the dark, churning foam. When the sun finally rose, the shore was littered with the wreckage of an empire, golden shields and broken spears washed up in the surf. Miriam, the sister of Moses, took up a timbrel and led the women in a dance of victory that shook the desert, singing a song of a horse and rider thrown into the sea, a melody of a people who were finally truly free. But the desert is a harsh teacher, and the euphoria of the sea soon faded into the grit of the wilderness. For weeks they traveled through a wasteland where water was bitter and food was non-existent. They grumbled and they doubted. Yet every morning they woke to find manna, the bread of angels, covering the ground like hoarfrost. And every time they thirsted, water gushed from the dry flint of desert rocks. Finally, 3 months after leaving Egypt, the pillar led them to the base of a jagged, granite monolith, Mount Sinai. The mountain did not welcome them. It trembled. A thick, dark cloud descended upon the peak, pierced by jagged bolts of lightning and the blast of a celestial trumpet that grew louder and longer until the very earth shook. Moses ascended alone into the smoke, disappearing from the eyes of the people for 40 days and 40 nights. High above the world, amidst the thunder and the glory, the finger of God carved the destiny of mankind into 2 tables of stone. But below, the people's patience had failed. Convinced Moses was dead, they surrendered to their old Egyptian habits, melting their jewelry to forge a golden calf, descending into a riot of ancient idolatry. When Moses returned carrying the law, the sight of the calf broke his heart. He smashed the tablets at the foot of the mountain, a symbolic shattering of the covenant they had already broken. It took intercession, judgment, and a second ascent for the covenant to be restored. But when Moses finally came down the mountain for the last time, his face was so radiant with the reflected glory of God that he had to wear a veil. He brought with him more than just rules. He brought the blueprint for the tabernacle, a tent where the Creator would dwell in the very center of his people. Reflection. The story of the Exodus is the ultimate archetype of the human journey. It reminds us that liberation is not just about breaking external chains, but about surviving the wilderness of the soul. Pharaoh represents the ego that refuses to let go, while the Red Sea is the point of no return that every person must cross to find their true purpose. Even after the greatest miracles, we often find ourselves longing for the leeks and onions of our old bondages. Ultimately, Moses' journey teaches us that freedom isn't the absence of a master, but the choice of a better one. The transition from being slaves of a man to being servants of the infinite